Professor Borrowdale, and we're going to talk about arguments today. So get into the meat of critical thinking. We've been doing a lot of what you might call like preliminary work on critical thinking, but I think it's really important to think like, why is it important to do critical thinking? And what exactly am I doing? And is anybody, I'm just curious, is anybody, do they do like sections on critical thinking in high schools? No? Nothing?
Not
Yeah.
anymore.
So, sometimes they'll say that they're teaching you to think critically, when in reality they're trying to get you to sort of go along with what your instructor's view is. And, or like this sort of dominant view of the culture, or I don't know, some fill in the blank, I suppose, the goal of educators. And so often, like what's chosen to be thought critically about, it's like, let's tear the crap out of this argument put forward by this person with whom I disagree. Awesome.
There you go, Professor.
Let's thank you.
Yeah.
Some hydrogen dioxide.
You got some good water boys.
Chemicals, yeah, it's a good thing it's not H2SO4. Anyway, so often you'll see critical thinking used in an academic setting, and it's used as kind of a placeholder for criticizing views which are opposed to the established view, the view of academia, or maybe the view of a particular professor. And I try not to do that. And I try to be aware of my own biases and my own presuppositions. But I think there are some things that are just foundational to critical thinking that if you don't really understand them, you're kind of off, you go off in left field and you're more, what's the word for it, more vulnerable to really bad arguments from people that want to sort of suck you into their worldview and then, polarize you and point you in a certain direction, often involving politics. So, so let's talk a bit about what we've reviewed so far. What we've done so far. And then we'll get right into talking about arguments. Let's see. There we go. Homer Simpson. So we talked a bit about what critical thinking is. It's thinking as opposed to feeling. So it has to do with, and what is thinking? Thinking is about concepts and ideas. It's about what's true and false in an objective sense, not what you'd like to be true, what you hope is true, what you have believed all your life. I hear this certain late night talk show host I listen to, who often believes sentences with, well, I've always believed that X, as if this gave some legitimacy to the view. And just because you've always believed something doesn't mean it's true. And I can think of beliefs I carried with me like for an embarrassingly long period of time before I stepped back and said, well, wait a minute, why do I believe that? Or I had all these reasons I thought proved this view, but now I'm not really sure. And so the idea is you want thinking involves something outside of tradition, outside of your personal biography and history, outside of your desires or your hopes. And it has to do with trying to get in touch with the objective world. And that's what you get. Now, you can't do that with your feelings, right? Your feelings might be a window into your values and what's important to you. But then the question is, well, how do you get it, right? So if you have... so if you have some goal or desire, like, think of something like, what would be an example of a goal a person might have? Any goal? Big or little? Winning the Olympics, right? So if you think about winning the Olympics in what sport?
Basketball.
Basketball, right? So maybe you read something on the internet that like meditation is the key to high peak performance in sports. And so you like join a Buddhist monastery. Instead of practicing, you just sit there and like visualize yourself like making baskets, like for 8 hours a day. And every once in a while, one of the masters comes up behind you and whacks you on the back with a big stick. That's supposed to help. So they say. There's certain traditions of Buddhism, they do that. They call that sudden enlightenment. So it's, well, now, there actually is some evidence that visually rehearsing things can help, right? But if that's all you do, then that's bad, right? And so if you don't do these other like real world things, it's one of those things that can help a little bit, but it's not, but what's going to make the best difference. So they actually, they compared people that just visualize with people that just practice, with the people that practice and visualize, and people that do neither. And the people who did best, the people who actually practiced and visualized at the same time. So, so you want, and there's lots of other things, like you want good health, and then I don't want to pick on any particular diet. You think good health is like taking all these supplements, like you're taking lots of vitamins. You have like 50 vitamins, and you're like taking vitamins every day. And then like, what do you eat? Well, like lots of red meat, and you love bacon, and lots of sugar and fat and salt, because you think, hey, as long as I'm taking my vitamins, I'm going to be healthy, right? So again, this is means ends reasoning. So, and it doesn't matter that like maybe your family sells vitamins for a living, right? And actually, I remember there was this guy who was super into vitamins. It turned out his family actually did own like a vitamin business. So he's super excited about vitamins and takes a lot. And I think he had like, he downplayed the importance of diet, which is, and all the objective studies on vitamins show either small benefit or almost no benefit from vitamins. Now, certain vitamins like vitamin D, particularly up in these latitudes, is good for you, and it's hard to get natural vitamin D unless you go out and buy a full spectrum light and sit under it, or get into a tanning bed. It might give you cancer. And so the vitamin D, there's like little things that are going to help. But this idea of like taking all the alphabet of vitamins and then just living a sedentary lifestyle, not eating any vegetables or fruit, and eating large quantities of meat and fried foods and all those things that are give you cancer and heart disease, like that's a bad way of going about it. And the only way to sift through the evidence is to look at objective scientific studies and make a judgment, and not just go based on your personal history, what you heard, or like what you'd like to be true. Like if you're about to inherit like a mega vitamin business, it's like your family's going to leave, megavitamins.com to you. You might have like a special interest in thinking vitamins are great. And then what you need to do is be aware of that bias. You think, oh, I really like this to be true, because if it's not true, that means my parents have been selling snake oil. They've been, getting people to pay them hundreds of dollars every month for stuff that has little efficacy. If I run the business doing this, I'll be a fraud and sham. And I'll probably feel guilty about it. So there's all sorts of motivations for you to think, oh, vitamins are this panacea that are great for everyone. So it's important to be aware of that. So to be objective instead of subjective. Also to be skeptical. So credulous just means it's the opposite of skeptical. You just believe everything you hear, everything you read. There's an old Asian proverb. It's believe everything you read, better not read, right? So it's important to have a skeptical attitude, and the idea is that you shouldn't accept any belief, statement, proposition, unless you have sufficient evidence for it. And this goes with W.K. Clifford's dictum. It's always wrong for anyone at any time in any way to believe anything on insufficient evidence. You always want to have sufficient evidence for your belief. And until then, you should maintain a kind of let's see point of view. Be agnostic about things that somebody's people suggest to you that there's not evidence for. And we'll talk a bit about like what counts as enough evidence later on. Also, it's systematic versus compartmentalized. So critical thinking, when you're thinking critically, you're not only like looking at the particulars of the case you're looking at, but you're looking at how it fits in with all your other beliefs. And hopefully if you've done things in the right way, all your other beliefs have evidence for them. And so you have some new case, there's some reason to err on the side of your belief system if you've built it up carefully and made sure each step along the way, okay, I get enough evidence for this, enough evidence for that. And you have this kind of web of beliefs. And this new thing pops up and it's, cold fusion or polywater or something like that. And you're like, that's kind of weird. Like that conflicts with all known science that you can do fusion at room temperature, or that there's some new form of water or something like that, or it could be some other like variant. Communism actually works on a large scale in this country, right? And you go, I don't know about that. It doesn't seem to go too well in these other countries. So whatever it is, right? And so you have now. Doesn't mean you always default to your belief system, but at least it means you got to be skeptical, and especially skeptical of things which conflict with other things you have good evidence for. And the thing you want to watch for is inconsistencies, right? So I talked about like, okay, you're Joe conservative, and you're like, oh, I'm a strict constitutionalist. If it's not in the Constitution, the government shouldn't do it, particularly federal government. And you go, okay, well, what about the war on drugs? Well, you got to keep people from taking those drugs because our society will just go downhill, and we'll be drug addicts strung out on the sidewalk, and I bring my children by them, and heavens of Betsy, Mabel, where's this well and smelling salts, right? So you just and this idea that okay, well, you're strict constitutionalist when it comes to say guns, Second Amendment, or when it comes to maybe freedom of speech or freedom of religion. And you think those are in the Constitution, so they're the absolute and inviolate. But when it comes down to the 10th Amendment, which says, well, unless it's a Constitution, the federal government can't do it. And then you come up with like the war on drugs. You think, well, wait a minute. I mentioned this before, like prohibition actually amended the constitutions to prohibit the use and maybe just the sale of alcohol. I have to look at the exact wording again. I'm a teetotaler, so that one hasn't been a special interest to me. But they amended the Constitution to prohibit alcohol, right? And then they amended it again to repeal that amendment. And people have this idea, well, it's not in the Constitution, so we actually need a constitutional amendment to make this legal. War on drugs, just Harrison Narcotics Act, just pass it. And all these other drug laws, federal drug laws, all passed, and this large-scale billions and billions of dollar, war against drugs, which is really a war against drug users, and I suppose the people that supply them with the product they want. So you look at that from a legal point of view. You think, well, where is the legal justification for those laws? So we never live in a nation of laws. Federal laws are based on the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution says unless you get special permission to cover this certain area of life, you can't regulate it. That's right there in the 10th Amendment, which James Madison thought was superfluous. He thought, well, why do you need that one in there? Of course, the federal government can't do something that's not authorized to do, but I think it was smart to put that in there, but it's still ignored, right? So but that's an example of an inconsistency, right? On the one hand, you say, well, I'm a strict constitutionalist, but when it comes to the war on drugs, oh no, suddenly you're like you believe in an activist government and the federal government having its fingers in things that it has no authorization to be involved in, right? So be aware of those. And sometimes people will point out inconsistency, like, and maybe it's not, right? People will say, I think of an example, like abortion and the death penalty, right? So sometimes people will make this argument, well, if you're pro-life, why are you pro-death penalty? That's inconsistent. What do you think about that as an argument?
When a baby goes and kills somebody, then, I mean...
Yeah, so the question is, like, who's being killed? Isn't a little baby, your fetus, pick your nomenclature, right? or like a guy who's committed multiple homicides, like this guy that shot up Vegas, right? So then you think there really is a difference. So it's not like the pro-life person is against all taking of human life, and that if you're not, that's inconsistent, that you have to be sort of all or nothing. So it's always wrong at anywhere, at any time, by anyone to kill anybody else. You think, well, there's self-defense, there's defense in the life of mother, and then maybe there's execution for a capital crime, such as murder, with extenuating circumstances, and that seems like a perfectly consistent view. Yeah.
That's why I think groups are just, they shouldn't have been made. Like, okay, like you're left or you're right. That statement alone just doesn't make sense, because everyone will have a certain view, even if it is left or right. So like, if I was completely right, I can still agree with some leftist views, and that's okay. And some leftists could agree with rightist views. I don't know, and that's why I think it's kind of ridiculous.
It is like these ideologies, they're based on like group movements, and they're not always consistent. Like, it's sort of an odd thing that, and it happened for kind of historical reasons, that like the so-called religious right is sort of married to conservatism. So it's sort of, you think about like things like free market capitalism or gun ownership, do those naturally go with regulating internet porn and keeping people from smoking weed, or subsidies to people to give people tax breaks for having more kids, or whatever the things that that people, so-called social conservatives, like to do. So yeah, so why is free market capitalism? There's sort of, think about there's kind of the libertarian wing of the Republican Party, and the conservative ideology too, and there's a lot of overlap between the two, but they're not synonymous. Well, let's talk about the conservative viewpoint. So the conservative viewpoint is one of limited government in all areas of life, but somehow in America, for various historical reasons, that got married to super religious people that want to impose a religious morality on you and me, right? Those two things, to me, seem to clash. But in the conservative ideology, it seems like it's, what's the word for it? It's people don't see it. They think it fits together in a nice little puzzle, a nice little package. Yeah.
It's kind of interesting that you just brought that up, actually, because I have a friend who I tend to debate these issues with a lot on Facebook, because he lives in Grants Pass, and it just tends to come up there. A good place to start fights.
Yeah, good on Facebook.
Yeah, and yeah, actually, he posted the other day about the taking a knee situation, and one of the first things that he wrote was, "Wow, it really surprises me that this football player is a Christian and also a Democrat." And I was like, "Well, why? Why does that surprise you?" And he had all these reasons about like why a Christian should never be a Democrat. And I'm like, well, all of these reasons you can refute very easily. Like, I can believe all of these things and be a Christian if I want to. Just because I may not partake in some of them, it doesn't mean that I can't give that right to other people. It isn't my business, in my opinion. Why can't I support that and be a Christian?
Comes right back down to the grouping thing.
Yeah.
Just because you're there, you have to believe all these things.
Yeah.
It's like, that's so not
Coincides with that group.
I will say, like, the Democratic Party has gotten increasingly hostile to people of faith, and so there's like sort of political climate type things, I guess. But there's no, there used to be a lot of conservative Democrats who are by and large religious in the South, that were you had basically your blue dog and your yellow dog Democrats, and they tend to be the more kind of conservative versus the more liberal. You think about liberalism. Why is it that liberals are pro-choice? So they say, well, we believe the government guarantees your right to abortion, but they're sort of but they're in favor of the nanny state. So you can do, but I mean, basically on the liberal side, you can, the government regulates every aspect of your life. It's your carbon emissions, it's, whether you can have trans fat. The First Lady was nagging school kids and everybody else about their diet, and threatening restaurants if they didn't cut their salt, or threaten McDonald's if they didn't start offering apple wedges instead of French fries, and lecture about the whole nanny state thing about smoking, whatever it is, sin taxes of all kinds, regulating business. But you have an absolute inviolate right to have an abortion, to have a gay marriage, to have sex with whoever you want. And so like those like little areas are sort of like this circle where you have these absolute rights in a general idea that government should regulate our lives. See, I think this is why I kind of like the libertarian idea, because it strives for consistency. So the idea is you have freedom across the board. And so you sort of marry the freedom ideas from both the conservative and liberal ideologies. And I think you get the best of both worlds. But I suppose you could go the other way, right? You could go full totalitarian or something. And you could say, well, I like the big government ideas on both sides, authoritarian, totalitarian. I don't know. I suppose you could just say it's like a big government view. So anyway, regardless of which of those views is the best view, right? What you want to do is avoid this kind of internal contradictions in your beliefs, so that in this one case you adopt this one viewpoint, but in this other case you adopt this other viewpoint, and these two beliefs run against each other, and you don't see because they're compartmentalized. So what you want is like a worldview, so that everything kind of coheres into a system. Now, you don't want to be dishonest in order to get things to fit in your system. So that's always a tendency, right? So just because you have a system doesn't mean that if you suddenly come up with like a round peg and all you got is square holes, you're going to fit in there, right? Or vice versa, I guess. I guess that's the square peg and the round hole that gives you issues. So you're trying to jam it in there. So you don't want to do that just because you have this system. You don't want to try to look at all new evidence to fit into your system. The idea is that you look at the evidence honestly and you say, okay, well, in this case, which seems to have more going for it, the system I've built up and these particular principles that I hold, or this new piece of evidence that conflicts with my system. And depending on how strong the evidence is and how good your system is, one or the other is going to have to go. But you want to try to hold on to both of them, because that's an inconsistency and a contradiction can't be true. So one of those things should go. So you want to try to strive for logical consistency. And then again, what's the goal of critical thinking? Well, it's knowledge of the truth. So you want to have true beliefs and avoid false beliefs. I think that's all I got on here. So, and our vehicle for doing that is argument. What's that?
You want big government, you must not love Jesus.
Yeah. I mean, there are certain reasons. Like, Jesus was sort of apolitical. He said, my kingdom is not of this world. And I will say, a lot of people, I give credit for people like Cal Thomas and some of the old-style conservatives that said, we tried that moral majority thing, and we tried to use the government to try to spread our faith, and it just didn't work. It was a dead-end street, and we're going to make more progress appealing to people on the basis of morality, and not trying to use the government as a cudgel to get people to believe what we want them to believe or behave the way that we want to behave. And I give him and other people credit. And I see this does seem to be a sea change in the government and amongst the attitudes of people about these sort of things. And I think even increasing acceptance of gay marriage is good. You have a lot of conservatives now saying, well, gay marriage is okay as long as you don't sue me and close down my business because I won't bake a cake for a gay wedding. So that's kind of where they want to draw the line. But at least they'll say, you can have your gay marriage. It's not my business. Yeah.
I did actually, if it's a question that I can ask, because I don't know if that's where you want to take the discussion, but I did hear recently about that same situation, the couple that wouldn't bake the cake for the gay marriage, the gay wedding. And I heard, one argument that was made is, a free and open market. You have to serve and treat everybody equally, not dependent on your views and biases, because otherwise, what kind of society would that create? but also every business reserves the right to refuse anyone for
Yeah.
any reason. So like, where do those two combine? I was just
It's
curious.
co-
if you
co-
thought or if you
I mean, there's a
hadn't.
contradiction in the law. So they carve out these special protected classes. So if you fit a certain definition, which is ever widening, but still prescribes a narrow number of features, the business, if they turn you away or discriminate, it's illegal, and then the government throws a book at them. But the conflict is that you have a right to practice your religion, and you can't be deprived of the free exercise of religion. But also the law, you have I think an Oregon state law that says it's illegal to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation. So then you have these two things, and they clash with each other. Usually the court decides. But you have all these weird things that happen, like I don't know what, if someone, depends on like how much guts someone has to appeal and how much resources they have. But if I have a right to practice my own religion, suppose I'm a Jew, can a neo-Nazi come into my store and make me make like kosher food for his Nazi gathering? Or what if it's like Church of the Creator, which is like a white supremacist church, right? You go into like Abraham's catering, right? And say we want you to cater our neo-Nazi event and serve we want ham sandwiches, we want deep fried shrimp, and that's that's just those two things, right? According to the law, for our white supremacist church, according to the law, if he turned them away, that he would face stiff fines and civil sanctions, maybe even criminal sanctions.
For just turning down services.
Yeah, because
I
it's
don't know,
discrimination.
I think you could just let the economy control that. If they're willing to turn it down, then they're willing to not accept that money. They could just go to someone else.
That's one of their views, yeah.
Seriously.
Ruin people's lives because of a little scam.
But then the question is, can you do that to someone because of their skin color?
Yeah, but I mean, how quickly is that place going to go out of business when someone's talking about like, yeah, they turned me down because they said something rude to me like that? It's like, I don't know. I think as like a business, you should always treat people the same. If you don't want to do something for somebody, then you're just losing out on money, and they're not losing anything.
And that's kind of a libertarian argument about the market is that businesses run their own business and should be free to do things beyond fraud and things that are like harmful to the environment or something. But that does take us a little afield. But so they can come down to consistency, right? Is it consistent to say I can't turn you away because of your race, religion, sexual orientation, but I can turn you away because you have tattoos and piercings, or because you're fat, right? Or just because I don't like you. So there's a question about, does it make sense to have these policies carved out for certain interest groups and not others? If you think the law should be consistent in its application. Okay, let's talk about arguments here. So, they're always using green. I like to know who's doing this. This doesn't show up well at all. Sorry about this squeaking. So an argument, one or more premises put forth to prove a conclusion. Okay, so the argument is the whole thing, and the argument's made up of two parts: premises and conclusion. Sometimes an argument might just have one premise. So a premise is just a declarative statement. We talked about those last time, like it's any declarative statement that's true or false. I think about it's hard. You think about a premise. What might be an example of a premise that you might put forth to try to prove a point?
Scenario?
Maybe we should start. Let's start out with the conclusion, actually. So the conclusion is the point of the argument. It's what it's trying to prove. The premises are the proof. They're the evidence, if you like. Right? So what might be something you try to prove to somebody?
That electric cars are better than gas?
Okay, electric. There's like a more, like better in what sense?
Environmentally better.
Okay. Yeah, so electric cars, are environmentally better. Let's just leave, and sometimes there's like implied things in the conclusion. I'm just gonna leave than gas cars, just assume regular cars. So electric cars are environmentally better. So then what evidence might we give for that?
Emission rates?
Yeah, so electric cars. How much emissions does an electric car have when it's going down the road?
Zero, probably. It's all electric.
Zero.
Then the counter argument would be how many emissions are released trying to produce the energy to put into the car.
Yeah, so actually, as this argument stands, so we just have one premise. So if someone said, electric cars are great. They're totally clean and green, and you're driving your car down the street. You're emitting no carbon whatsoever. They're great for the environment, much better than gas cars, right? So conclusion: electric cars are environmentally better than gas cars. Premise: electric cars have zero emissions. But then the counter argument, as you said, would be, well, where does the electricity come to run the car? Or what about like the, what do you call them, the substances in the batteries? Or when the battery dies and you got to dump it into a landfill or something, that's going to contaminate the water table. Where does the electricity come from for electric cars? Coal-fired plants primarily, right? So you could have like a back and forth. And so as it stands, it's kind of, this is what I would call as a weak argument. This is also like a, not to say that you can't make a stronger argument for it. So, but it's this is what's called an inductive argument. An inductive argument is one where the premise doesn't guarantee the conclusion. So inductive arguments are when you give evidence, and then the more evidence you have, and the better the evidence is, the more likely the conclusion is to be true. But it's never 100%. Now, it might be like 99.999%, but it's never 100%. So it's inductive, and you sort of like gather all this evidence and pile it up and say, look, see all this stuff? That implies this conclusion here. And sometimes we'll say this support the evidence supports the conclusion, right? It's kind of a metaphor. So you have the evidence, which is the premises, and it sort of supports the conclusion. And in inductive arguments, it's some degree of probability. And inductive arguments are either strong or they're going to be weak. So you look at, and sometimes it's hard to tell, and there might be some that you think, well, it's not the best argument, but it's not a bad argument. Maybe you want to shore it up or something. But generally speaking, you look at an argument, you can say, well, it's weak for these reasons, or it's really, this is a really strong argument. Maybe we could shore it up, but it's pretty good. And a strong argument is one that proves a conclusion. A weak argument is one that doesn't quite make it. And you can kind of think about some standard of measure where you're thinking, well, how much evidence is enough? And if you pass that point, then the argument is strong and it's proved its conclusion. If it doesn't, then it's weak. And so this argument here, I think, it's a nice start, right? And it's true that electric cars don't have any emissions. But you think about you want to look at things like getting rid of the batteries and the cost of manufacturing. And actually, it turns out it gets quite complicated with the electric cars. Yeah,
Plus,
did you
that
have a comment?
conclusion could change with time. You know, if we threw away coal power and we just went purely to wind and solar, then, I mean, that would change the argument too.
Oh yeah, if the empirical facts change. So the world's always changing, and
Yeah.
so sometimes the facts can change. And but I don't think gas cars. I'm trying to think of a case in which like well, in any given argument, the conclusion is sort of, it's indexed to time, so it is what it is. But maybe whether the argument is strong or not might depend on whether these premises are true. And since the world is always changing, maybe it's different. Maybe like the government passes a regulation that says you can only use these types of batteries that are really bad for the environment. Maybe all the electric cars are, they're already running coal, which is, probably is kind of as dirty as it gets. Although, I mean, coal is actually, they call it smokeless, but it's like, low smoke coal, which is actually much better for the environment. And so it's, despite what you might hear from Osberg, the clean coal technology is pretty good. And the U.S. is a Saudi Arabia of coal. But there is this idea of like efficiency, right? So there's lots of complex things. Like one thing about like electricity, you lose some of the energy when you're going on power lines to try to get out to who's at the end user. But electric cars, the electric engine is much more efficient than the gasoline engine in converting energy into movement. So it turns out that, and the amount of energy, so the amount of energy you have to put into it in terms of electricity is really, really low. So then the question, it's an empirical question, is whether the environmental impact of all the old batteries and the manufacture of the batteries is going to be greater than the impact from emissions from burning the gasoline.
Said probably not, since we already have to recycle gas car batteries. They want that, like they charge quarter fees to recycle them. Well, they'd probably be the same with electric batteries. They'd recycle them still versus tossing them out.
I mean, coming up with biotech, of course.
Yeah, I suppose you could say, that a regular car needs a battery too, so maybe it would be a wash.
The
So,
only thing I can think of is the electric battery would cost more than the other batteries, so the production might be worse for the electric battery than for the gas battery.
yeah, and that's like, the question is like, what's relevant, I suppose. Like one thing is like electric cars are hugely expensive. That's why they're often subsidized by the government. And whether that subsidy, whether it's worth it, so you do a cost-benefit analysis. But that wouldn't affect like whether they're better environmentally. Then you have like a separate argument maybe, which is like even though you argue even though electric cars are better for the environment, they cost so much to make that it's not worth it or something. I remember I penciled out like if I got one of those little, what do you call those things? Leaf. If I got a Leaf, they have leases on Leafs and they got the new ones coming out, so the old ones are really cheap. I had a friend that had them for like $179 a month for a lease. I'm like, holy cow! It's like, and I looked at how much gas I spent on my Toyota, and I was like, I could have like a really nice car with like, it's got this really like, it's got like a seat warmer that like in 2 minutes your buns are toasty, and like a really nice stereo system. It's a new car, right? I'm driving my 1994 Toyota that gets like 25 miles a gallon or something. I pencil out even with gas prices at rock bottom levels, it would be about the same with the amount of driving I do. I'm like, well, that might be an option. But that's a different argument about like economic efficiency versus environmental impact. There's another question, like empirically, like the question about how bad are carbon emissions or other emissions from cars that have catalytic converters on them and so on and so forth. How bad are they for the environment? But then if this is a comparative conclusion, right? It's comparing this to something else. So that may not even impact the argument at all. If you're just saying they're just better than other cars. Okay, so here we just had a simple argument, one premise, one conclusion. This this premise supports this conclusion. So when you're making an argument, you list the premise. There's premise number one, and then you have a little. In logic, you use these three little dots here, which means therefore, in kind of a triangle. So electric cars have zero emissions, therefore electric cars are environmentally better. So usually you'll have more than one premise. What might be something that would be more? Anything in the news or argument you had with a friend or?
You said an argument that's more what?
That has at least two premises. So what might be some conclusion a new conclusion, you'd have at least two things that you would say to try to prove it. You're trying to convince somebody of something. Yeah.
For the Vegas shooter, there were video recordings of close shots and faraway shots, and there were also pictures of windows blown out on multiple levels. So that would infer that there were multiple shooters.
Okay, so that's the conclusion is there were multiple shooters in Vegas. And then premise was there were windows broken out at different levels.
Oh, so it wasn't just one window?
Different levels. And then what was the other premise?
There were video recordings of shots that were clearly closer by and shots that were clearly further away.
I'm not sure. I'm trying to understand that premise.
Long range and short range shots simultaneously.
Distance,
But in the same
distance
hotel,
between
though?
What?
In the same hotel, though?
In there was a video recording that from what I saw in the premise that the video was saying is because you could hear shots that were closer and you could hear shots that were further away, the distance between those, they couldn't have been the same shooter, if that makes sense.
Okay, so this has to do with like an analysis of like the audio.
Yes.
So maybe I'll just put, and often these arguments, like you state a premise and the question is, well, what's your proof for that? And then another argument for that premise, what's your proof for that? You can just go on forever. So until you read something that you think that sort of establishes this premise. So, audio reveals, what, that,
Shooting distances?
yeah, I'm not sure I understand how that's supposed to work. But I'll just put that down. I'm just going to go for it. Different shooting distances. Now, one of the things when you're looking at argument, there's like several things you can do when you're trying to look to see whether it's a strong argument or a weak argument. The first thing you do is ask yourself, well, if these premises are true, would that be a really good support for the conclusion? And it seems. What do you think? What do you think about this? So if it's true that windows were broken out at different levels and the audio revealed different shooting distances, would that, if those premises were true, would that convince you that there were multiple shooters? Yeah.
When you say windows broken out at different levels, do you mean like in opposing buildings, like, or in the same hotel building?
Different floors, like different actual floors.
So, but in the building that the shooter was supposedly in, or in
The same building for
Yeah.
what I was watching on Facebook.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So, so if these premises are true, would there be a way for the conclusion not to be true?
It could have been a distraction.
I mean, it could be that somebody shot back, or it could be that,
There were guns rigged up.
I suppose, yeah, that's a possibility, maybe more remote, but it could be that, authorities shot back, or it could be that something, swung out from the room and hit a window below. My understanding was that he was in a suite and it sort of goes around the corner, so there's a lot of corner room, so it was kind of large, but I haven't looked at it carefully. but just the idea that, okay, here, these two premises might be true, the conclusion might not follow. The other thing is that this first premise, I suppose, you just look at the windows, but you need proof for that. As far as the reporting I've seen on it, it looks like it's from a suite. I looked at it, and it's hard to kind of tell from the small photograph, but so that would be something you might challenge, right? Or at least ask questions about. I want to know, are these really on different floors, or is just like the point of view of the photographs or the video that you're looking at? And then what is it, this second premise seems like the one that's a little more problematic, at least to me. I wonder about what this idea you'd hear the shot, that the audio would reveal different shooting distances, or if you had like a rhythmic rat-a-tat and then another like isolated shots, going back and forth, and it wasn't the authorities, that might be something. But that caveat isn't there, right? Was it the authorities? So anyway, this is and again an inductive argument, two premises and a conclusion. Now, how about so these are both inductive arguments. Let me do a deductive argument for you. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. I should write that out. I was abbreviating here. Socrates, father of philosophy, died drinking hemlock, which is deadly poison.
Why did you drink it?
He was executed. He had, I think, a choice of execution
They
method.
didn't tell him it was poison.
Yeah, no, this is Steve Martin thing, right? Steve Martin did some comedy sketch where he Socrates drinks the hemlock and wants to go out and get some Chinese food, and they didn't tell him. They're like, every day, Socrates, what is truth? Socrates, what is justice? Socrates, what are you ordering? But not once did you tell me, Socrates, hemlock is poison. So anyway, all men are mortal, means that they can die. Socrates is a man, so what would the conclusion be, therefore?
Socrates is more.
Yeah, Socrates. So this is a deductive argument. Now, deductive arguments are either going to be valid or invalid. Valid. It's different from strong and weak, because with deductive arguments, it's either all or nothing. So if it's true that all men are mortal, if it's true that Socrates is indeed a man, then it's guaranteed 100% that Socrates is mortal. So now, what happens if Socrates drinks a hemlock and says, okay, guys, let's get some Chinese food, and see many the worse for wear. And the jailers come in and say, Socrates, you got to die. And he says, well, I drank the hemlock. And maybe one of the guys says, okay, well, we'll do this the hard way. Sticks a sword through him and pulls it out. And Socrates says, ow, that hurt. But he's still alive, and it pierced him right through the heart, right? So then I suppose you could say, okay, something wonky is going on here. Maybe either it's not true that all men are mortal. Maybe some men are immortal. Or maybe Socrates isn't really a man, right? He's like a space alien, or he's a god, or something like that. Right? But if it's true that all men are mortal, and it's true that Socrates is a man, you know with 100% certainty that Socrates is mortal. So the question is, like, if you got 100% certainty, why would you ever use an inductive argument? Like, if deductive arguments guarantee the conclusion is true, 100%, no doubt whatsoever, why would you ever use an inductive argument where you're just kind of sloppily putting together evidence?
Because they're never as straightforward as that. It's usually a lot of other sides to it.
Well, isn't straightforward good? Like, it's like really clear.
Oh, yeah.
And you know that if these premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. It's not that it might be true or probably is true. It has to be true. 100%. I'd like my conclusions to follow 100% from the premises. That would be great if like I can make all my arguments like that. Like, here's my conclusion, guaranteed 100%, no doubt whatsoever. Yeah.
Well, how would you define that? Because I would hope that everyone's beliefs to them are logical conclusions, so they would view that. So how is beyond a reasonable doubt for one person the same for the other person? Because what if another person doesn't believe that all men are mortal, or
So here, like, the validity has to do with, if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true as a matter of logic. So it doesn't have anything to do with psychology, right? So, and you can think about, like, maybe in terms of, like, the form of the argument. If I have an argument, and I say, you know, all A's are B's, and then, you know, X is an A, therefore X is B. You know that it doesn't matter what A and B is here at all. If these premises are true, this conclusion has to be true. Right? You can just sort of see it as a matter of logic, right? And you can play, I mean, if you want to play hardcore empiricist, I suppose you could plug in things and see if they work. You know, like all cats are animals. You know, Millie is a cat, therefore Millie is an animal, and try it like 500 other times just to be sure. But you should be able to like look at this and see, okay, that doesn't matter what I put in there. If all of one class are members of another class, and a thing is a member of one class, then it's got to be a member of the other class, right? It's just by pure logic. So again, why wouldn't you just try to structure all your arguments like logical syllogisms? And we'll talk about some other ones, modus ponens, modus tollens. And it's like there are these things that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true.
But X isn't always B, right? By that one, right? Because all A's are B's, X is an A, but A is not all X's, so not all X's are B.
No, it's just not, we're not talking about all, we're just talking about this particular one. So this is like, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. I could say, you know, all
Not all mortals are men, but it's still kind of the same thing.
yeah, it follows the same pattern as the argument. I could say, you know, all men are mortal. I have two M's there, so I can't, if I use try to use the letters from the words, it's not going to be helpful. But the idea is that if you have two classes of things, you can do this with Venn diagrams with these overlapping circles to make it maybe graphically to show if you have like a set of all men and all mortal, you know, beings, and show that all men are mortal beings, and if you put a dot in in the mortal beings in the men category, it's also going to be in the mortal beings category. So this is just true by matter of logic. And you can kind of see, right, the logic of this. And so if Socrates doesn't die, you think, well, one of these two has to be wrong, right? Either Socrates isn't a man, or all men aren't really mortal. And the problem with this, though, is that when you're making an argument, it's only as convincing as your premises, right? So in order to make an argument deductively valid, you have to create some really implausible premises. Now, this is a pretty easy one, but you'd have to, like, come back to this shooter thing. You might say, well, whenever windows are broken out at different levels, that shows there are different shooters or something like that. And you go, well, why should I believe that? Right? Or whenever you hear shots in different times, that means that there's a different gun shooting from distant distances. And you think, well, that's kind of weak too. So the only way to get 100% certainty from premises to conclusion is to water down your premises and make them implausible. I'll give you a handout with maybe some more examples of these to show that it really just, it might seem like a good idea, but it doesn't work. Now, deductive arguments are good for some things, but not for others. And sometimes you get them, normally what you get in like everyday reasoning is inductive reasoning. Occasionally a deductive argument will pop up, but typically you get inductive reasoning. Sometimes in fallacies, you'll see people make a deductive fallacy. That's actually more common than people using a deductive argument. Okay, so we're at our break time. Let's take 10 minutes. We'll come back and talk more about induction and deduction. Okay, so let me read you a couple of arguments and see what you think. Actually, let me read you a couple of things and see if you think these are actually an argument at all. So one of the things that's important to do is be able to recognize whether something's an argument or not. So remember, an argument, one or more premises put forth to prove some conclusion. So if a person, and the idea of the conclusion, the purpose of the argument is to convince you of something or to prove something, right? So this is what the whole proof part is. So if somebody's not trying to prove something, it's not an argument. If you can't identify the conclusion, and you should always, whenever you hear an argument, you want to ask yourself, well, what's this person trying to prove? What's the conclusion? And start with the conclusion, and then work your way back to the premises. Okay, well, what's their proof for this conclusion? And it's important to recognize what the conclusion is, otherwise you're going to be talking cross purposes. So let me try a couple here. So first, is it an argument? And then see if you can identify what the conclusion is, and then we can talk about the premises. Let's see, some of these are a bit old. Dear John, I know when you left for the Army, we said we'd be together forever. But I've been spending a lot of time with your best friend Frank lately, and we have fallen in love. I can't see putting my life on hold, waiting for you to come back from, oh, this is really old, Bosnia. So I guess this is goodbye. So is that an argument? It's just like, it's information, right? It's like, basically, I'm breaking up with you because you're in the Army and I'm taking up with your best friend. It's just imparting information. Now, she's not like making an argument, you never should have left me to go out and play soldier boy. The war in Bosnia is immoral, right? She's not going to try to convince him of anything. She's just telling him we're done, right? And I'm going to be with Frank now, right? So that's just imparting of information. So sometimes people will just be giving you information. They're not really trying to convince you of anything. They're just telling you. How about this? Rush Limbaugh sucks. Okay, so what, is that an argument or not?
No.
It's just like a claim, yeah? Right? So now the person may be trying to convince you of something, right? If they say like Rush Limbaugh is a big fat idiot, right? If somebody says that, then it's a claim. It's maybe an insult to Mr. Limbaugh, but it's not an argument. They're just making a bold-faced claim of evaluation about the intelligence or worthwhileness of Mr. Limbaugh and his program. So let's see. Brooke Firestone is one of those moderate, middle-of-the-road politicians. You know what happens when you stand in the middle of the road? You get run over. Tom Bordenaro is the man for the job. If you're smart, you'll vote Bordenaro for Congress. What do you think about that? Is that an argument or not? If so, what's the conclusion?
That guy's the one for you.
Yeah, vote Bordenaro. So the conclusion is you should vote for Tom Bordenaro for Congress, right? And then what are the premises? I'll read it again. Brooks Firestone is one of those moderate, middle-of-the-road politicians. You know what happens when you stand in the middle of the road? You get run over.
So he's very likely to be a failure of the representatives that choose me, because I'm not going to get run down. I'm not going to be standing out in the open with a target on my face.
Well, middle of the road is kind of a metaphor, right? So this idea of a moderate, this is one of those moderate politicians. So there's a guy that's, kind of in between liberal and conservative, liberal on some issues, conservative on others, and this person takes a dim view of that. Yeah?
Is this an inductive argument?
It is an inductive argument, yeah. So the premises, we'd say, Brooks Firestone is a moderate. And what happens when you stand in the middle of the road, you get run over. So there, I think we could like translate it into moderates are bad or something like that. And then there's this another premise. Tom Bornaro is the man for the job. And that's, what does that even mean? It's, I suppose you'd say that he's a good candidate. And so a choice, when you're voting, you're always voting either or maybe there's three choices. Typically in our elections, you've got two people who have a chance of winning, and then you have the Libertarian. And maybe a Green Party and some other people, right? So, but typically, it's a limited choice, right? You can do right and whatever, but it's the chance if you actually want to make a difference in the election, you're choosing between main party candidates. Although you might have a long-term strategy of voting for your favorite third party. Right. So the arguments here are, Firestone's a moderate, moderate's a bad, and this other candidate is good, so therefore you should vote for him. So it's like three premises of varying degree. You might have different evaluations about whether they're any good or not that are supposed to prove the conclusion. And so it is an argument. It's not a very good one. Part of this, like whether an argument is strong or weak, sometimes depends on your audience, right? So if the goal of an argument is to sort of convince someone, then you want to pick premises that are going to appeal to them, and which are true, but which they're going to find convincing. So what's a good argument for one person might not be a good argument for another person. This sounds kind of relativistic, but it's more of a point about like, have you really proved your case? And whether you're going to be convincing or not is going to depend in part on who your audience is. Let's hit another one here. 3 members of a bizarre teenage vampire cult brutally murdered one of the youth's parents yesterday and afterwards are reported to have drunk their victim's blood. The youths, whose names are being withheld because of their age, were arraigned Thursday and shocked the courtroom with cries of "Hail Satan!" According to police spokesman Frank Brennan, the youths were unrepentant, joking about the killings with one another as they were led out of the courtroom by deputies. The judge in the case has denied bail. So is that an argument? No, it's not. It's a news report, right? So it's not really trying to convince you of anything. It's just reporting the facts, right? So typically the way things are supposed to go anyway is that when you read like the regular section of the newspaper, that's like the news stories that tell you what happened. And then you go over to the opinion page, that's where you find all your arguments. Now sometimes the arguments sneak into the regular section of the paper and you get propagandized or you get maybe slanted news coverage. But typically, like if you have a press report like from AP or something like that, the Associated Press, or UPI, or Reuters, right? They'll tell you like this happened, that thing, the other thing happened. They're not trying to convince you that they happened. Maybe they're telling you why people think it happened that way. But typically, they're not even giving you they're not telling you who their sources are. They might mention, according to this police spokesperson, so and so. But they're not. It's not those aren't arguments. So it's just if someone tells you a story, gives you information, gives you a news report, those aren't arguments. Let's see. Religion's dark history includes the Spanish Inquisition, the Crusades, and the Salem witch trials. Religion's effect on society is by no means always a positive one. So is that an argument? I see some people nodding their heads. So what's the conclusion?
Religion isn't always a positive force.
Yeah, good. And then the premises are, premise 1, you could say the Spanish Inquisition, premise 2, the Crusades, and premise 3, the Salem witch trials with, sort of understood premise that all these things are bad, that they're negative. And then the conclusion that sometimes religion is negative or religion isn't all positive, right? That seems like a pretty decent argument, right? Notice that the weaker your conclusion, the stronger your argument. Right. So what if instead of that? Damn it! I don't know what I did here. I don't know what 96. Oh well, I'll fix it later. We'll fix it in post. Cut here. So if your conclusion of the argument, what if I were to say religion's dark history includes the Inquisition, the Crusades, and the Salem witch trials. Religion has a dark history of oppression and death. It's and should be wiped from the face of the planet. Right? There's a really big conclusion, right? Or what if I say that the history of religion is only evil and inhumanity? That would be a really strong conclusion, but it'd go way beyond the evidence I provided, right? I'm just giving you a few examples of some bad things. Doesn't mean religion doesn't have a lot of good things too. So because this conclusion is so weak, it just says, well, religion isn't always positive, and there's some people that think that, right? They think, oh, as long as if it's religion, then it's got to be good. It doesn't matter what kind of religion. Doesn't matter. And your world religions are all pretty much the same, and people don't think about Satanism or the Spanish Inquisition, where people are tortured to death for their religious faith, or because they didn't have the right beliefs, or because they were Jews or what have you. Okay, so the weaker your conclusion, the stronger your argument. Now the thing is, you haven't proved as much, right? So it's kind of it's a trade-off, right? Then when you're done, you're like, okay, I've proved my conclusion. What is your conclusion? Maybe it's not as the conclusion you wanted to prove. It's something really super weak. Like Descartes did this when he wrote his Meditations on First Philosophy, and his original title was like a proof for the immortality of the soul. And one of his friends, I think it was Thomas Hobbes, said, well, Descartes, you really haven't proved the immortality of the soul. All you've proved at the most, if your argument's valid, which I don't think it is that the mind and body are distinct. And so Descartes went back and fixed it and said, okay, weaker conclusion. The new title was about the distinction between mind and body. And that's a much more humble point to make, and an easier point to make, because if he'd written his Meditations and told you, and therefore the soul exists, you're like, well, that I'm not convinced. But if he argues that mind and body are distinct, it's a lot more plausible argument. Let's see. All these political examples. How about this? If I don't exercise, if God had wanted me to bend over, he would have put diamonds in the floor. Okay, this is kind of a joke, right? But is that like an argument? It's kind of sort of, right?
Sure.
So then the question is like, what's the conclusion? So I don't exercise. If God wanted me to bend over, he would have put diamonds on the floor.
So it's sort of like the lack of exercise is the promise. You don't have to work out.
This is actually a Joan Rivers joke. I don't exercise. If God had wanted me to bend over, he'd have put diamonds on the floor. Well, let me I'm gonna skip forward a little bit. Let's try something simpler. How about if God had intended man to fly, I'll quote in the original sexist language, to fly, meaning humanity, he, or sexism, would have given him wings, capital H. He would have given him wings. You know, actually said here. So what about this? What would be, is this an argument? Oops. Is an argument? What's the conclusion?
Men shouldn't fly.
Yeah, but whereas I don't see neither of these sentences say that.
I mean, I guess it points to that.
Yeah, good. So this is what's called an implied conclusion. So sometimes you got to really look at an argument to figure out what the person's point is. They don't always state it overtly. Henny Youngman used to have this joke where he'd like going to give an example for something. He'd say, "Take my wife, please." Right. So that's sort of like that. It's like implied statement. It's not really an argument that his wife. He wants to unload his wife on somebody because he can't stand her, right? But it's kind of like that joke relies on this sort of implied conclusion. So here the implied conclusion is that we shouldn't fly. And this is actually something that somebody actually said when looking at when airplanes were new, and the idea you're going where man wasn't meant to go, and if God really wanted us to fly in the air, he would have given us wings. So the conclusion is we shouldn't fly, and the premise is, well, if God had intended man to fly, he would have given wings. And we also have something else implied. So implied conclusion, and there's also implied premise here. What's the implied premise?
Like God exists?
That's actually, I mean, it's said, I think it's, so there's a difference between an implied premise and something that's like background knowledge, I guess, or assumed.
The only way to fly is with wings that grow on your body.
Well, what would logically, point to the conclusion? If I say, if God intended man to fly, he would have given him wings, therefore man shouldn't fly.
That man doesn't have wings?
Yeah, man doesn't have wings, right? So then you think, well, that's obvious, but sometimes they're not so obvious. But in this case, to make this logically valid, you have to say, okay, well, if God intended man to fly, he would have given wings. He didn't give him wings, therefore man shouldn't fly, right? And maybe another understood premise. What else might you add there as another understood premise?
You can't fly without wings.
Okay, yeah, actually that might be, but I mean that's more background knowledge, right? It's assumed in the argument. How about like that we shouldn't do anything that God didn't intend us to do or something, right? So that's being assumed that if you say the conclusion is man shouldn't fly, and it's all about God's intention, that's we might need another argument, implied premise there to shore it up, and anything that God didn't intend us to do, we shouldn't do, right? So.
The argument is, well, what does he intend us to do?
Yeah, that was a good question. Like, did God intend us, to get dental care? Right?
It's like, are we not allowed to swim because you don't have webbed fingers or feet?
Well, there you go. Yeah.
Why would we be given unlimited curiosity if we weren't meant to?
Yeah, I think this is. See, I think this is. It's an argument, but it's a bad argument, right? Because you think about all the things that human beings have done to change their environment, from dentistry to quadruple bypass surgery to those squirrel suits, right? You've seen those. People make artificial wings. So you have flippers that people wear in the water. You have the squirrel suits that people wear where they can glide, maybe not fly. And you got the hang gliders, right? So people actually can fly now. It's kind of cool. Not just in an airplane, but you can actually do it with wings, right? So that's kind of cool. Artificial wings. Okay.
Jetpack soon.
So you have, sometimes you have implied premises, implied conclusion. Let me hit one more here. Well, why don't we have somebody else suggest, like, what's something you might want to prove to somebody? Let's take one more. Anything you would, that you have wanted to prove. It could be for a class, it could be in a political argument, it could be a personal dispute. Just remember, we're going out on TV.
That artificial intelligence is the key to transcendence.
Is. What do we mean by transcendence?
Evolution?
Okay, can we say like progress, just to maybe we'll try to have a humble conclusion.
Progress.
AI is the key to human progress. And then what would we have as premises?
An AI can think faster and contain more than our brains can at one moment.
Yeah, so AI can think faster, and you might say like they can self-replicate and improve. So one nice thing, once the AI get going and they can make other AI, they can make smarter AI and so on. Although it might be, we might want to have an off switch someplace we can get at. Self-replicate and self-improve or something like that. And improve. Yeah, we just have those two premises, and you can think of like those two things. And this might be a kind of a strong argument, maybe an uncontroversial one, but maybe we could put like a implied premise might be AI pose no existential threat to humans or something. And you use your judgment when thinking about these implied premises, because for any argument you can say, well, it's also we're assuming that the Earth is round or something like that, and we're also assuming that But this seems to be a fairly big one, threat to humans. So some people worry a lot about AI, that once the AI starts getting super smart, that it might not have any use for humans, or might start doing things that might not be good for human welfare. It's an interesting question. One we're actually talking about in the Theories of Reality class in this class next term. Yeah, so this is a fairly strong, good argument. How about we could do a bad argument? How about how about this? Abortion is wrong. And premise one, Margaret Sanger was a white supremacist. And eugenicist. Margaret Sanger founded Planned Parenthood. Which does most U.S. abortions. abortion is wrong, or you shouldn't have an abortion. So, okay, so we have two premises, a conclusion that abortion is wrong or you shouldn't have an abortion, strong argument, weak argument, what do you think?
Weak.
Yeah, it seems weak. So what's weak about it? Why don't the premises support the conclusion?
Doesn't it kind of imply that if you get an abortion, you're a white supremacist?
Yeah, it seems like you're participating in white supremacy. It was the whole idea behind Planned Parenthood is to try to get not just minorities, mostly black people, also people that had genetic defects to keep them from breeding and passing their defects on to the next generation. And Sanger thought that being black was one such defect. And that was her view. So she was a white supremacist and she was a eugenicist, and she did indeed found Planned Parenthood. You know, people get I think Hillary got the Margaret Sanger Award for supporting abortion. But even if that's all true, and if it's true and is true that Planned Parenthood it does most of the abortions in the United States, or a vast majority of them say, would that mean that you shouldn't get an abortion? That abortion is always wrong.
Wrong to who? Wrong for what reasons? I don't know.
Well, let's assume, for the sake of argument, there's like objective morality that like white supremacy is bad, and that abortion is either wrong or right under certain circumstances.
I feel like the premise doesn't really support the ending conclusion. Like, I think it makes more of a comment on the institution of Planned Parenthood and on Margaret Sanger herself, and not necessarily that abortion is wrong. Like, it really doesn't say anything about abortion.
Right.
You're saying because the people that do it are bad, it must be bad.
Yeah, this
You're
is
not
what's
explaining
called.
what's actually bad about it.
Sure. So it's like, and this is what's called the. We'll get this later when we talk about fallacies. The genetic fallacy.
Like saying that Catholicism is wrong because priests rape little boys. You know what I mean? It's like saying the institution is bad because of one set person or continuously set person.
Yeah, that actually might be a
Again,
different.
grouping.
That might be a different fallacy. There's some overlap. Depends on how you look at the fallacy. But at least one way in which this is wrong, just because that's how Planned Parenthood is founded, doesn't mean that's what it's doing today. It doesn't mean like that Planned Parenthood is an organization that's whose goals is to exterminate black people or something. Right? That's not the purpose of the organization today, even though that might be the purpose of the organization when it was founded, right? So just because something happened way back when doesn't mean that that's the way it is today. So that's the genetic fallacy, says that you can take something about the origin of something and then draw some conclusion about it today, and that doesn't necessarily work, right? So, and it doesn't talk about like abortion as an act itself. It's talking about like the history of abortion organizations. So that's a separate problem. Mm-hmm. All right. Let's see. What might be an argument you would make? Anybody get any arguments lately?
Solitary confinement is cruel and unusual punishment.
All right. Solitary is cruel and unusual punishment. And then like some premises.
One of the leading causes of most mental issues is isolation from friends and family.
Yeah.
So just isolation in general has like a massive effect on the human condition.
Yeah, so humans are social animals. You can go from the social science. Empirical studies show severe suffering from lack of social contact.
Most of the reasons that people are in jail can actually be worsened by isolation, like drug addiction or any kind of like mental instability that they probably possess. or do for this or whatever.
Yeah.
So a lot of the conditions can be worsened by using that as a punishment.
And so here this seems like a fairly straightforward argument. Seems to be a strong argument. I don't know how you might argue against this. If this cruel and unusual is a phrase from the U.S. Constitution that the Constitution prohibits it. So if you want to argue that it fits like the definition of cruel and unusual punishment in the Constitution, it might be a little more difficult because the question is like, well, what was around then? And these cruel is unusual is just, I suppose, is related to what the practice is. If you look at the intention of the people that wrote this, it's about things like drawing and quartering or boiling people in oil, or people basically be tortured to death. But then the question, I suppose, is psychological, psychological distress, is that a form of cruelty? And you might argue that it is, but you might need some more stuff in there to try to establish that. I want to jump a little bit ahead into talking about like valid argument forms. So let's talk valid and invalid argument forms. And to start out with, let's talk about the. I'm going to jump ahead and talking about these logical operators. And the first one is the horseshoe. And this is called the if-then. Or if-then, or the conditional operator. And so you take a class in logic, and this isn't a class in like formal logic. We're just going to do a little bit of this to get you to think about how these things work in ordinary arguments. So an if-then statement, you say, well, if P, then Q. Where P and Q are just premises in argument, statements. And that's written as P horseshoe Q. And P is known as the antecedent because it comes before. And Q is the consequent, consequent, because it comes second. Consonant's the opposite of vowel. Consequent. Oops. Now try that one more time.
Logical operators of arguments or thought
For arguments. So when we're looking at arguments in symbolic logic, that there's symbols that go along with certain forms of logic, of logical statements. So if you're going to make, so if you have a conditional statement, if it's raining outside, then you're going to get wet on your way to your car, right? So so that would be a conditional statement. And if it's true, then so we'll talk about the truth condition in a minute. I don't want to get too far ahead. But if P, then Q. So if this one thing is true, then the other thing is true. That's what it's asserting. So the P part is the part that comes before. This is the conditional statement, if so-and-so. And then Q is the consequent, because it comes after, consequently. And so in an if P then Q statement, or a conditional statement, the whole conditional is going to be true based on whether either the antecedent, the P part is true, or whether the consequent, the Q part is true. So, get another page here. So, And we could just take the statement, if it's raining, that's not really an argument. That's not a very good argument. Let's take something that's more argumentative. I don't like using examples that are sort of things people don't argue about. How about this? If a fetus is a human being, then most abortion is murder. So then what if this is true and this is, then let's see. So if it's true that, if this is true and, let's see a great way to say this. So what this is saying is that if this first statement is true, then the second one follows by logic. So if a fetus is so in case this is true, if this whole thing is true, then this is true and this is true. So and in a conditional statement, what happens if this is false? So both these have to be true for the whole thing to be true. Yeah. Maybe I should start out with the and. Got 2 minutes here. So we want to know with this whole condition, if the statement is true, which one part do we have to find out is true? So if we know this first thing is true, then we know this second thing is true if the whole thing is true. So now, if it turns out the fetus is not a human being, then it turns out that abortion wouldn't be murder. And it could be abortion turn out to be not be murder for any other reasons too. But this might be something you would use in an argument where you use the conditional form. So that if you know this first thing is true, then you can guarantee that the second thing is true if the whole conditional is true. I don't know if this is the best example to use. Let me just put this aside for a minute here. Let me just jump back to and or. So, P and Q, and talk about P or Q. So if you have two statements, if I say, oh, I hear the music faintly. Let's start in on this on Tuesday. So I'll put out a handout on these coming out on Tuesday if you look at it over the weekend, and put some other stuff in week 2, and we'll talk some more about logical operators on Tuesday.